The story I want to tell you involves a family that is fictional. However, they are a composite. They are representative of the many families that traveled the Boone's Lick Road in the 1820s. It was early morning, Monday, August 11, 1821. It was a family by the name of Henry. Garfield Henry and his wife Mary, and they had with them 4 children, the oldest, Zachary, who was 10 years old, and one enslaved African American that went by the name of Solomon. And they were leaving St. Charles and headed west. The celebrations of the previous day were still spilling over, as Missouri had just become a state within the United States of America. They were headed out to territory known, but yet lots of unknown elements. They were headed out filled with optimism about a new home that they would establish. Now, they were saying farewell to a farmstead that they'd had near St. Charles for nearly 10 years, one in which Garfield and Mary had occupied about the time Missouri had become a territory. But it was a bittersweet leaving. Well, sad because they had been there for 10 years and all of their children were born there and one buried there. But yet it was joyful because they were filled with the hope and optimism of finding a new home. Well, the road beckoned. Well, the Boone's Lick Road in 1821, not exactly what you and I might think of as a road. It was a trail, or more precisely, a network of pathways at that time. By later in the 1820s, there would be property owners each vying for their portion of the trail to become the road. Well, if you can imagine walking in a Missouri woods or prairies through the brush without hard surfaces, without a manicured hiking and biking trail, you'd have some idea of where they were headed. It was not long ago I walked about 5 miles in the Missouri woods, and it was a hot, humid, warm season day, and 5 miles was enough. But imagine if you were trying to go 10, 15, 20 miles through the brush. Well, they set out in a wagon about 4 feet by 10 feet, with nearly half of all of the worldly possessions that they had accumulated earlier. The wagon was pulled by 2 oxen, but they took with them 2 horses, 1 milk cow, a bred sow, a cage full of chickens, and lots of hope. Now, Solomon drove the wagon. Garfield and their 10-year-old son Zachary sometimes rode the horses, but mostly they walked, as did Mary and the children as they were able. Riding was a luxury in the wagon. They were taking all of their possessions they would need for the farmstead that they had purchased near Franklin in Howard County in Boone's Lick country. Garfield had made a trip earlier to assure the purchase and to see the nearly 200 acres that he was able to buy for just a few cents an acre. But all of the things they needed for the trip had to be in that wagon. There were tools and materials needed to repair the harness, for the wagon itself. They had to take, of course, with them tools to clear brush, sometimes on the way, but the tools they would need to clear the timber from the land that they were to occupy. And of course, they had the items they needed for the journey. So you might find items such as stoneware or a Betty lamp or candle molds. Of course, axes and saws. And they needed the kind of equipment to prepare and preserve food once they were at their new place. Now, they took with them some food. Well, you might find along the way were salt pork and perhaps biscuits, corn dodgers. But they also would have to probably supplement their food along the way. maybe clubbing a rabbit or two, or perhaps shooting a deer, but that, of course, had to be field dressed and prepared. Everything in the wagon had to be packed for ease of carriage, but also ease of unloading every night in which they would have to camp. Well, as they set out that morning, they knew they would make Pond Fort by evening. And with any luck, in 3 days, they would be at the Lutter River. And there they would join with other travelers, more than likely. The Lutter represented about the halfway point between St. Charles and Boone's Lick country. And there, of course, they would have to unload and make camp, set up everything, do evening meal, and then load things back up the next morning. So imagine doing that in the brush, in the woods, every night, unloading. And imagine the traveling as well, managing the livestock. Now, it was young Zachary's role to make sure the sow stayed with them. But they had to manage the children. Now, there were constant dealing with the environment as well. There indeed would be muddy days, and that would make traveling worse. Now, they were leaving in August, so they would deal with primarily either heat and humidity or storms, but the insects would be always nagging at them. Had they left, as some did, earlier in the spring or later in the summer, they might have to deal with freezing or snowstorms. Now, what food and water they could carry with them was good, but they would have to make sure that there were fresh water options, more than just the one barrel they carried. Well, this was a journey that others were making, but a journey that would have its own hazards and difficulties. At various times, they might be with other groups, and at various times on their own. It was not a time in which the road had maps, and certainly there were few places to stop for provision. In fact, they wouldn't have manufactured goods that had come from the east available at the nearby store. That mostly what they had to use was what they would carry with them. By the end of the 1820s, now the Boone's Lick Road could be clearly identified as a road. Well, as early as 1816, there was a reference to the Boone's Lick Road in some surveyor's notes from the time at Lutter River. But it really was not until later in the 1820s that you began to see permanent settlements, began to see stores and taverns and stage stops that would occur along the way. So pretty much they were on their own. Now, one might ask, why make such a journey? Well, it's a human characteristic of migration. We all have been involved in some sort of movement from one place to another. We check our own ancestry and see how many times our families may have moved. It's always a matter of what some call push and pull factors. Some folks may be forced to migrate because of cultural or political or economic pressures, fleeing a war or persecution or a natural catastrophe. Others have more of a pull that bring them to a new destination, the opportunity of new land, of new employment, the opportunity of a place where they would be free of oppression. And it is the case for those like the Henrys who traveled on the Boone's Lick Road, a combination of push and pull. Well, one could imagine, again, occupying new land. But I need to remind you that they weren't occupying wilderness as we might want to imagine. It was a place of occupation. For hundreds, if not thousands of years, Native Americans had occupied that place. The trail itself may have had its origins in pathways that Native Americans had taken for hunting. We know that as early as 1808, William Clark, formerly of the Corps of Discovery, had led a group of 80 on horseback out to establish Fort Osage, and he was led by Nathan Boone. They had gone through a pathway that had been used by some who'd gone to work at the Salt Lick out in Howard County in Boone's Lick country. There, a salt lick that was operated by the sons of Daniel Boone and also the Morrisons. But that pathway was still rugged and still difficult. They had to be prepared for what any situation might arise. Now, their destination was a place, as I mentioned earlier, might have been occupied by others, Cultural geographers use the term sequent occupants to talk about the layers of people that may move. And for them, a place occupied first by Native Americans, but they were also a part of a larger movement now of European Americans who were finding this new frontier in the West. Imagine, if you will, camped one evening, and there's the father, Garfield, finishing up the chores, putting things away, getting beds made, and here comes young Zachary, and as a 10-year-old, asking lots of questions. So, Papa, why is it that we had to leave St. Charles? Papa pauses for a moment and says, well, I know that in our family history, we had family who were forced out of places and had to move, and that's really not the case for us. We didn't have to go. But a few years ago, when I knew that there would be land opening out west, I knew that we would have greater opportunities than we have here. It's our choice to start a new life in a new place. We're not be crossing the Atlantic Ocean. We're not be going through mountains or deserts or climbing over glaciers or dealing with difficult situations like that. But what we had here in St. Charles, we're now beginning to run out of resources. Folks are coming from the east, and it is getting crowded. And Zachary says, oh, Papa, yeah, you said it was, the things were getting crowded in Kentucky and Tennessee, and that's why your folks and you came to Missouri, wasn't it? Well, you're right, Zachary. Crowded is one way to talk about it. But you know, the pressures upon population to move further west are there because folks, we're finding the soils were being depleted and finding, well, we know that back east, the scares of malaria have been important. And for us, it's an opportunity we couldn't say no. Now, I'd made a trip out earlier, as you know, a few years ago. We would have gone earlier, but about the time that we were beginning to start our family, the War of 1812 had interrupted movement further west. And then I was ready to go after that because land was being offered to those who had served in the War of 1812. The earthquakes of the New Madrid Fault had given opportunities for people to accept new land out further west, and the price was right. But then we had in 1819, just 2 years ago, an economic difficulty. We just couldn't afford to do anything, and now the time was right. We can make the move. I had enough resources to put some money down on the land, and because I'd been there to visit it, I know that I wasn't going to be swindled by lots of land opportunities that weren't real. Zachary understood his father and felt some assured, and he said, well, you said it was our freedom we had to go, but what about Solomon? He didn't have a choice. Garfield had to agree. Well, you're right. We do own Solomon. And lots of folks who are moving to the Boone's Lick country are acquiring other African Americans to work their farms. He's our farm worker, and I just hope that he'll find a better life out in the Boone's Lick country than he has here. And then Zachary said, now what about the Indians? Are we going to see Indians? Well, I don't know that we won't, but it was just a few years ago that many of the Native American groups were caught up in the War of 1812, some siding with the British and some with the Americans, and there have been hostilities. In fact, the trail we're taking at one time was just a trail that connected a series of military posts to protect and defend folks that were there. And I hope that the hostilities are all over with, but you're right, it was their land before ours. And many of those groups have been moved further on west. And I think we probably ought to just give thanks that we have the opportunity to have those who will work with and for us, and give thanks for those whose land it was before ours. Well, 10-year-olds. Zachary had other questions. Well, Papa, I want to know, why didn't we take a boat? Well, Garfield said, Well, the first reason is we couldn't afford to. But I want you to imagine if we were able to purchase a ride on a barge, having to load all of our stuff in a barge, and then move that barge upstream. Would you want to spend all your day pushing and pulling, perhaps wading in the water and struggling like that? It's easy to send things down the river following the current. It's harder to take them upstream. But for us, taking the wagon across the trail, much more efficient and affordable. We can carry our goods with us and have access to them along the way. Now, you notice the route that we're taking, and I've done some scouting before. We don't follow the river exactly. We're running parallel to the river, but we take, as some of the folks say, take the ridges, not the river. But we have found a passageway that avoids some of the steepest grades. Getting that wagon, and we'll have some to come, getting that wagon up and down steep grades is difficulty, and good places to cross the streams, fording the rivers that we have to. Now, Zachary was curious about the pathway, but he also was curious about the prairies. They were already seeing some open fields that appeared to be, and he said, well, how come we aren't going to stop and stay on one of the prairies that we see? Now, I remind you that the steel plow was not perfected, the iron plow was not perfected until 1836. When they had wooden plows, they were really not capable of turning that tough, grassy sod into farmland, but would work fine among the forest soils, in among the stumps after the trees had been cleared, and to work some of the softer bottomlands. But Garfield explained to Zachary, I'm not sure I like the prairies. You know, there are fires there regularly. Some are naturally occurring, but some have been set by some of the natives and others, and I'm a little suspicious about how hazardous it might be. And when the storms come through, I'm not sure. You know, where I grew up and where my family lived in Kentucky and Tennessee, we were in hardwood forests, and that's where we're going to. It's sort of like we're going from one very familiar, safe, and secure forest to another. Well, the more that Garfield talked, the more relaxed Zachary was getting, and you could see he was calming down and being assured that they were making good decisions about that journey. He, of course, wanted to know about others who made the journey, and Garfield had filled him in on other explorers that had gone before them. It hadn't been that long ago when Pike and Long had made their trips, and others like Breckenridge had reported of their travels. And so it was not an unfamiliar pathway. They would not know, but they were riding a crest of population that would begin to fill the Boone's Lick country. In fact, it was reported in 1819, 1820 that there was as many as 30 to 50 wagons that would make that trip. And sometimes hundreds of people would make that trip. And they would not know that throughout the rest of the 1820s, those numbers would increase. By the time you get to the end of the 1820s, now there really was a road. A road was being put in place that would take a southerly route through the newer communities of Fulton and Columbia. And clearly there would be a pathway on which taverns and stores and permanent houses would be built, not log cabins as they anticipated. By the 1830s, the Boone's Lick Road had become a road. Now there were permanent settlements and folks were stopping along the way. There were churches and banks and institutions being established, all contributing to what would make the Boone's Lick country a very productive region. Agriculturally, that region, contributed to by such families as the Henrys, would be producing products for internal consumption, of course, like potatoes and flax and other corn and hogs, but also producing material for export like wheat and hemp and tobacco and beef cattle. In fact, by the time you get into the 1830s, the Boone's Lick country, in population, in political power, and in productivity, rivals even that of the St. Louis community. That generation in which the Henrys represent began to produce artisans and merchants and doctors and educators and political positions, they were beginning to be a real powerhouse. And so we look back at the Henry family and say, those were the folks that had that kind of strength and endurance to establish this new center of importance for the state of Missouri. Now, one might say, well, was it worth the hazards of that journey? Was it worth the expenditure for them? Well, if you ask the Henrys, they would certainly say yes. But we need to say yes, too, for those of us who have benefited from what those people did. And again, benefited from what Native Americans had did previously, and the contributions of African Americans to making it productive as well. Well, would we be able to make that journey today? Would you and I have the physical strength, have the ability to work with the natural environment, have the sense of community and family, have the creativity, have the drive of a vision for us to survive on such a journey and be successful? Well, I'm not sure. But perhaps in these days of pandemic and social upheaval, we might be called to make a similar journey to a new destination. And I hope we would be as bold as those who traveled the Boone Road in the 1820s.